They start them young in Canada when it comes to teaching them the national sport, Mayhem on Ice. 700 kids are taking part in this year's Tiny Tyke hockey with equipment that is as good as any the pros use.
Hockey is America's newest little league sport, and the kids in Tacoma, Washington are taking to pucks like ducks to water. Murray Patrick, former New York Ranger star, organized the kids on ice and called it Pee Wee hockey.
There's a new hero on the international sports scene, Bobby Hull. The hockey ace of the Chicago Blackhawks suddenly finds himself besieged by autograph seekers after putting a new scoring mark on ice.
Picked up a little cut there.
There must be 150 different ways you can get hit or hurt in a game of hockey.
That's for sure.
Champion Montreal Canadiens get ready for the season's opener at their home stadium. Flushed with the victories of previous years, they prepare to tangle with the Rangers, 1945.
Think of the old six-team National Hockey League as a serial soap opera on skates. That every week there would be a drama that would carry over into the next week, so that you'd be playing the Blackhawks, say, maybe 3 times a month. Well, a fight that started on Saturday would be finished the next Friday, and the fans would know all about it. They'd know who the villains, who the heroes were, who to boo, who to cheer, what had happened, what the controversy was. And there was a real intimacy to this league. There was a competitiveness unlike anything seen today, because the familiarity did indeed breed contempt. These guys really were fighting not only for their own jobs, but fighting against the opposition, so that at this point, there are only 100 jobs in the National Hockey League. There are only 100 men who get to wear the colors of a National Hockey League team. And holding on to that jersey with both hands with white knuckles was a daily occupation.
I think I played in the greatest era. And if people want to see what the greatest era was, who the greatest era players were, look at the Toronto Maple Leafs from in the 40s through 67 before expansion. Look at the Montreal Canadiens, the powerhouses they had. Look at the Detroit Red Wings. Before Adams destroyed our team in 1955. And you'll see some of the greatest, and you'll be looking at the greatest, whether you want to call them legends or not, you're looking at the greatest hockey players that ever played.
What got me is that I knew all the players, 6 teams, and let me put it this way. When Montreal Canadiens would come to Detroit, they came in so often. Floyd Curry, I know if he needed a haircut or not. I could look and see it because they didn't have helmets, you see. And consequently, you got to know every player on the team. And what that meant was that you knew every player. You knew whether they were playing up to their ability or not, or having a bad night or a good night. And you could get involved.
Every game had a playoff atmosphere, had a competitiveness that was very endearing to fans. Who wouldn't want to watch something like that? In certain ways, it was almost gladiatorial, with a certain style, of course, but the fact remained that what you saw competitively was part of an unending drama. There was a chain that continued throughout the year. So you'd remember a game in October where a player did something to another player. And that would be carrying on chapter by chapter through the entire season and maybe even into the playoffs.
Well, during that era, it's funny because from the time the Bruins won the Stanley Cup in 1941 till the time they won it in 1970, that Montreal, Toronto, and Detroit won it every single year with one exception. Chicago won it once. So out of the 6 teams, you had this domination of Montreal, Toronto, and Detroit. Then you had the other teams.
No advertising on the boards. No advertising on the ice, just hockey. They played the game. No wild music during the intermissions. No, none of the marketing and sales and all the things that dominate the game today. It was a game played for the game's sake.
It was the golden era of hockey, and always will be for a generation, not only of older fans like myself, but I find there are young fans who are very fascinated.
The players were different, and we played, in our day, we played by the rules. In fact, that's what you were taught. And the first day that we reported to camp, the coach gave us a rule book, and he said, if you play this game, you have to know the rules. So actually, we had more knowledge of the rules than the officials did.
It is a bygone era. For 25 years, the National Hockey League consisted of just 6 teams. The North American cities of Montreal, Toronto, Detroit, Chicago, New York, and Boston were homes to elite franchises known today as the Original Six. While they weren't the first 6 teams to compete in professional hockey, they are the enduring ones. From 1942 until 1967, these teams competed against each other 14 times a year in a quest to raise Lord Stanley's Cup. The competition was fierce, not just to win a championship, but also to retain your roster spot. The great arenas of yesteryear swelled the capacity on game nights to witness a rough-and-tumble sport define itself through grace and skill. And if you weren't able to see it live, your mind's eye was the next best thing, as radio was the medium of choice across the countrysides of Canada and the United States.
The main means of conveyance of these games early on was through the radio. Now, everyone played the game in Canada of a certain age or had had some experience with it, so it didn't take a lot of imagination to know that when Foster Hewitt was broadcasting from the gondola at Maple Leaf Gardens, you could sort of see in your mind's eye what was taking place. And these broadcasters were master storytellers as well.
I think the fact that we were closer to the players, we were privileged to travel with them, the beat writers, the regular writers for the 2 papers, and the photographers too, for that matter. We traveled and we were with them, and we saw their ups and downs. And I think the camaraderie and their private life was private.
The broadcasters of that time did not dumb down the game or did not bring anything to it that didn't exist. They were very straightforward, very respectful of their audience, respectful of the players whose action they were describing, and conveying some of the drama that was taking place.
When they first started broadcasting, you would have like the Hockey Night in Canada broadcast. A national broadcast was a big thing. And the games would come on, they'd be black and white.
It was an era when they didn't wear helmets. And if you were a broadcaster, that was pretty important. You identified the player just by looking at him. You didn't have to look at his number and look at the program.
Broadcasts were simpler. It didn't have a lot of the razzle-dazzle. They barely had little chyrons underneath telling the score.
Today's 30-team National Hockey League has expanded its player base to include more than 700 athletes from countries around the world. But during the original 6 era, barely 100 jobs were available league-wide. The cream of the crop considered it an honor to adorn an NHL sweater. And despite American cities hosting 4 of the 6 franchises, the rosters were dominated by Canadian players. It is, after all, Canada's game. With fewer roster spots, every contest was like an all-star game. The best hockey players in North America were counted on to bring skill, creativity, and passion 70 nights a season. Rarely did they disappoint.
That's what it was. It's competing against the best. And if you did get any kind of a little injury, you didn't dole on it because there was always somebody in the minor leagues that was there ready to take your spot. And you didn't want that to happen. So if you were injured, you'd play through it if you could play.
Your job was in jeopardy every game. If you didn't play well, you might end up in the minors. So you played under a lot of pressure. Today, they have rosters at 25. They dress 21 and 4 of them sit in the press box. We didn't have anybody sit in the press box. When you're notified you're playing bad, down to the minors. So you had a lot of pressure on you every game playing. Not only that, but in practice as well, because they judge you as a complete player, and you had to play well in practice as well as in the game.
The game then was more skilled talent against skilled talent, with the same degree of toughness, and maybe more then, because these were the peak players.
Well, you have to be dedicated to the game. You have to just mind your own business and go out there, and if it required a good solid check, well, you'd have to, doesn't matter who it was, you'd have to hit and work. You had to have speed,
you had to have playmaking abilities.
We didn't do as much physical training as they do now. Now, if you go into a training camp, you see all kinds of physical apparatus. At that time, we didn't have too much at all. When you came to training camp, you came to training camp to get in condition.
The Montreal Canadiens franchise is the most dominant in hockey history. They have amassed 24 Stanley Cup championships in their history. To illustrate the team's lore, the combined championships of Toronto and Detroit, who ranked second and third in titles won, would still fall one short of Montreal's tally. During the original Six era, players claimed they respected each other more, played for less, worked harder in practice, and rarely received bonuses or incentives. And for the most part, it was all okay, as long as the sweater on their backs was that of an NHL team.
Many, many years, there were only one American. 99.99 was Canadian.
It was so different because you were so loyal to your sweater, you know. A trade was an insult. Nobody wanted to be traded. That was terrible.
It was a Montreal system. They always believed in headmanning the puck, pass the puck. If you want it back, catch up and get moving. And their system was skating. Move the puck, skate, and shoot.
Being a member of the Canadiens was a very big honor for anybody. And it was great to be on the team. And we were very fortunate. We had 16 guys that were compatible. We understood each other, and we all worked together, and that's why we were very fortunate.
I find that we had more respect for each other at that stage because there was no helmets, but any body checking that was done legally and with the body, and not around the head that you have right now, because they have helmets. I mean, let's ram him from behind and put his head through the glass. I find that they're finishing off let's say their checks more than in our day when he didn't have the puck. I mean, why run into him and try to kill the guy?
After the Stanley Cup, naturally you go in and sign with the manager or whoever, and I was assigned to Mr. Smythe. So I went in, I talked to him, I says, yes, Mr. Smythe, and he says, well, son, he says, I'm going to give you a $1,000 raise. Now that brought me from 10 to 11,000, and I says, gee, that's great, Mr. Smythe. I says, I had an agreement with Mr. Ross in Boston that if I had a good year, I'd get a $500 bonus. He stood up out of the chair and he says, son, he says, what the hell do you think I'm paying you for, to have a bad year? And this is a true story. I just got up, did an about turn, and walked out the door.
Well, our practices were tougher than games, which made the games easier. And with Dick Irvin as our coach, I can't say he was the best because I never played for anybody else but him. For me, he was the best. And he taught us fundamentals. And it got so that it was fun to play, and we couldn't get enough ice time.
Sports has always been defined by the athletes who play the games. During hockey's golden era, this was never more prevalent. Every team had a constellation of stars. But what made the sport unique was not only its 6-team format, it was also the rules of the day. Hockey in that era had no draft. The players claimed they were closer to each other and spent their off-ice time with teammates. The style of play was representative of the talent on the ice. Because of this, hockey's original 6 era will forever define the sport's history, and sadly, this history will not repeat itself.
When I played with Montreal, I mean, you got the Rocket, and you got the Elmer Locks, and you got the Bellevaux, the Geoffrions, and you got the Pocket Rockets, and you got the Phil Goyettes, and you got the Jean-Guy Talbots, and guys like that. I mean, we had 10, 12 superstars on the team. And every team had superstars, if you go to Detroit and Gordie Howe and Ted Lindsay at the time and all that stuff, and Boston, the same thing.
It was great. The camaraderie in those days was when we're on the road, after a game, we'd go out and have a sandwich and a beer and there'd be 17, 18 guys out of 20 guys go out to a nice restaurant or a bar and stuff and eat. And they tell me today it's not the same. They might have 5 or 6 guys.
When I played with Montreal, we had such a powerful house. Like, I don't know, I think we won 27 Stanley Cups or something. Yeah, 26 or 25 or 27. I stopped counting.
There wasn't too much coming in for players. I think we were getting like $6 a day to eat on. Now I think they're getting 70. It's quite a change. And I don't think they eat more than what we did. And even, it's more expensive now, but still not that expensive.
Each team, there was no draft back in those days. Each team was allowed to have a negotiation list, which was, they could have 25 names on that negotiation list. And so if I'm in Detroit and somebody was interested in looking for some player to go to Detroit, and his name was Lindsay, they'd have to call the National Hockey League headquarters and check with the other 5 teams to see if my name, Lindsay's name, was on the negotiation list of any other Toronto, Boston, New York, Montreal, Chicago. And if no Lindsay was there, well, then Detroit could put my name on there. Didn't have to give you any money. They just put your name on there.
Back then, you could have smaller players because the hockey was played more with the skills and the passing and stick handling, and not so much as today that shoot it in and bang them into the board. So you can get away with a few big, heavy-set guys that are not real good hockey players, but you need them on the team because that's the style of the game.
I love the original 6 because I feel lucky, very lucky, to have seen Max Bentley play for the Chicago Blackhawks. Most marvelous player, and he went to Toronto in a big trade, and it just was magnificent to see him play and what he could do. And I think of Bill Cowley, who played for the Boston Bruins, the greatest stick handler I have ever seen, including today. He's magnificent. And then, of course, we had Gordy, and we had the Rocket going head to head all the time. And that stuff was wonderful. But I liked other players, too. I liked the players on all teams because they were so colorful, and you see enough of them that you knew them almost personally. You could tell when they're going up the ice, you didn't even look at their numbers, how they skated, how Elmer Locke skated.
Hockey is hockey. But the only thing I can say, like these days, I watch the games, and sometimes that makes me mad because they shoot the puck in, and they go after. In our days, if I would have do that, I would have sat at the end of the bench. I wouldn't play. Because the coach, Toe Blake, especially when I first started in the NHL, he used to tell us, and the game is 60 minutes. If we control the puck 45 minutes, they only have it for 15. Who's got the best chance to win? So that's why, instead of shooting in, we used to grab the puck, give it back to the other defenseman, and start all over again. Now they got the puck, they don't know what to do, shoot it in. It's like if I gave you $2, now I got to go and get it back.
Red Story made the reference to the fact that we played in the greatest era of hockey, which was the late 40s through the 50s, and then maybe just the first part of the 60s, before expansion. And he said, it was the greatest hockey that will ever be played in the National Hockey League.
The choice of becoming a hockey player was easy for many. It was a game they loved. They played it on the frozen ponds and rivers of Canada since time was known to them. During the original 6 era, those who played the game for love of sport also worked during the off-season. The average annual salary for an NHL player at the time routinely came in under $10,000. But it wasn't always about the money. In today's high-dollar world of professional sports, many athletes live in mansions, own several cars, and feel a sense of entitlement. But for hockey's golden boys, living in a rented room with their teammates wasn't out of the question. While it may have been a simpler time during the 3 decades that spanned the original 6 era, sports was still about playing a game.
I had a choice of becoming a dentist and pulling out teeth, or playing hockey and get some knocked out.
The only thing I didn't like about New York was the living conditions. We had 2 children then, and you lived away out in Long Island. You had to rent a kind of a sleazy apartment. And the travel, you had to take your car halfway and then get the subway and then get downtown and things. Wasn't like Chicago, we could drive to the stadium, it was 15, 20 minutes.
It was my teammate. That was the friendship we have. And that's we live together. Nobody had a business before, you know. And today maybe hockey is the fifth business, the fourth business.
But if you go back in those days, the salaries weren't that great, so a lot of the players used to have to work in the summertime to maintain their families. You know, we do the work on the outside and then go to training camp after, so that's why we weren't in that great a condition.
Well, it was togetherness by the players, first of all, and we stuck together, we played together, we lived together. Some of the guys even slept together, I guess.
We had a 100-watt bulb with a reflector and a string on the bottom of it, but you couldn't put it any further down than that or else you'd burn the guy. So this is the way it goes, you know, in those days. But then again, you know, I look back and I laugh. I say, isn't that something, you know, what happened and what we went through? I think, like I said, we loved every minute of it.
We were in training camp a whole month, so, and I used to run a month before training camp, and we were in a month. Now they're in 7-8 days and they're playing exhibition games.
The funny thing is, nowadays with all the modern equipment, you've heard of whirlpools, which, you know, it's like a motor with a fan in a tub, sort of. Well, in my day, like, you know, we didn't have a whirlpool. So what our trainer did, you'd step into the shower and he'd get a hose and spray the hose on the sore part of your body. You know, a lot of people think I'm making that up. I'm not. That's true.
Played with the Bruins. I worked for a Ford dealer back home in Edmonton, Alberta, where I was born and raised. I worked for a garage, and I did many different things. I did from driving a tow truck to grease monkey to washing cars to shop foreman. It fit in good with the company because whoever went on his 2 weeks or a month holiday, I filled in his position. And those years we never made playoffs, so I had to work.
We made good money. Relative, you know, a loaf of bread was 10 cents. And a car, I bought my first car in 1947 for $1,950. Brand new Chevrolet out of the factory. And gasoline was 26 cents a gallon. I mean, you know, so everything's relative. We bought our first home in Edmonton for $12,000. You know, so a pound of hamburger was 25 cents.
You know, we just didn't have the accommodations that the players have today. You know, I remember one year some of the players slept at the Olympia because, you know, it was close to the rink. And in those days, I went to school in Windsor when I made the junior club, and we had to take a bus after school down to the Windsor Tunnel and go through the tunnel and get another bus on Grand River, go and practice at 3 o'clock, and of course, after practice, get back on the bus and go back under the tunnel and back where we boarded.
I worked for the Bell Telephone Company out in the highways. I was trimming trees, and where Art Ross, who was our coach and general manager, found out about it. And all of a sudden, during the middle of the summer, I got a letter from the Boston Bruins that says, "What's this all about?" It was from Art Ross, and he says, "We do not pay our players to climb trees." So I got my sister to answer him. I wasn't capable of writing a letter back which I wanted to. And I said, "You just tell him that if he paid me the amount of money that I wanted, I wouldn't have to climb trees."
And those times, they said we didn't make money. We made good money if you compare to my friend who work at home, you know. So I always smoked cigar. I went to play golf.
I always went for laborers' jobs because it kept me in good physical condition. One of my good jobs was with Budweiser, the beer people. I was assigned on a beer truck that delivered like the kegs, which was very good as far as staying in shape.
We was proud, you know, and we did like losing. You know. We only drink when we're winning, but we win all the time.
And in those days, they had to serve as beer salesmen or electricians. Famous story of Leo Labine, played for the Boston Bruins, and he worked for his junior hockey boss, Hap Ems, as an electrician, and tells a great story of wiring the wrong house.
In the old days, players as distinguished as Jean Beliveau played baseball in the off-season. Doug Harvey was a great baseball player. Jean Beliveau supposedly was once scouted by the Brooklyn Dodgers. So you have these great athletes that played other sports. Now, hockey players are hockey players from day one. And that's kind of sad because not all of them get a chance to play, and they've given up the opportunity to experience other sports competitively.
You know, we made pretty good money then, nothing like they do today, but it was a very, very good life.
It should come as no surprise that train travel was the preferred method of transportation for teams competing in the NHL at that time. With 6 teams neatly nestled in the northeastern regions of the continent, you were never more than a quick overnight trip from the next game. Players credit train travel with building a sense of team spirit and unity. It also allowed time for a few pranks along the way.
Travel in the 6-team league was wonderful. We traveled by train. We had our own Pullman car, except when we were going to Toronto and Chicago from Detroit, because Detroit was the greatest city to belong to in the 6-team league, because we were 5 hours from Toronto, 5 hours, 6 hours to Chicago. Same train to Toronto that you take to Montreal when you're overnight. Boston, you go into Albany and you either go into Boston or you're going to New York, which way. So it was a wonderful way to travel.
I remember one particular game going to Chicago from Montreal. We ran into a very severe snowstorm and we arrived a few hours late, and they had a police escort waiting for us at the LaSalle Street station in Chicago. By the time we got to the stadium, we weren't able to play any kind of hockey game because we were going through red lights and the sirens were going and everybody was scared silly. So it was togetherness, you might say, and we had lots of time to talk things over, and it was really a lot of fun, as a matter of fact. You didn't dare fall asleep on the train, or somebody would be lighting your newspaper or cut your tie off or something.
We had a chance to play cards. We didn't make very much money back in those days, but Mr. Adams wouldn't allow, you could gamble for a penny a point. That's all you could gamble for, because fellas were making anywhere from $3,500 to, say, $5,500 a year. And if a guy would lose, say, $50 or $100, he might not feel too much like playing hockey, or he might be mad at his teammate.
Original 6 teams, you know, there are so many things that happen that are so different than it is now. We only had the 6 teams, and we'd go to New York, and we'd stay there for 3-4 days. And it was all by train, a lot of times by bus. Very seldom we ever flew on an airplane. Didn't even know what it would look like inside. But we'd go to New York, and we'd play one game and stay there for 2 or 3 more days, so you had a chance to do a lot of sightseeing. I mean, if you ask the players nowadays, how many of those players had the opportunity to go to this Empire State Building, or how many guys went and seen the Statue of Liberty, you'd be lucky to have a handful. Because now it's just fly in, play the game, and fly out. Then those days we'd take a train in, and a lot of times we slept on the train. We had our own compartments. So we stayed right on the train. We had time to go visit different places, see the city. It was so different. I mean, it was an education itself.
The only reason they changed, I think, is the trains got, the service wasn't as good and the meals weren't as good, and they started flying in about 1956, 57. And flying was a lot better than the trains, naturally. And we'd just take the bus, like from here in the 60s over to Windsor, and we'd have a charter, Air Canada, and go to anywhere. So it was a little more comfortable. And you know, we used to park our cars at Olympia, and they'd take us by bus or to Windsor, so it was that much better instead of your wife having to drive you to the train station.
You know, it was just a thrill. That all those years that I'd rode the buses and the trains in the minor leagues, and to know that at least we're going to go first class, no more buses, you know, no more cold sandwiches.
all anxious to go to the big city. They had never seen a big city in their life. They came from the farms and the hinterlands of Canada, I guess. And the one advantage when we traveled by train, bus once in a while, the odd airplane trip. And you were a team, you were together. As a broadcaster, we were privileged to travel also on the sleeper train, on upper berth. And as a result, you were together after a game, 4 or 5 hours on the train, and you listened to their banter. They were going to get even, because you played each team 7 times, 7 times on the road, 7 times at home. And the back-to-back games between Montreal and Detroit back in the 50s, they were hilarious, because if they were embarrassed in Montreal, they were going to nail them when they got to Olympia in Detroit, and they usually did.
We didn't know any better in the 40s, in the 50s, because that's the way it was done. It was better in the bus league and the minors, I'll tell you that.
And not ever having played in the National League, my very first year, obviously I was just 20 years old, we flew a DC-3, and it was accepted. It was okay. Most of the teams in our league flew or took a bus, but we happened to have the luxury of flying a DC-3.
And then, of course, it was back-to-back games, Saturday and Sunday. What we'd do is we'd meet at Westmount Station, both clubs, if we're playing with the Canadians. And then what happened is that we'd all get dressed in a hurry to get to the train station before the Canadians, because it was a small station. And when it's 40 below zero, you don't like to wait on the platform for a train coming for about half an hour. So whoever got there first went into the train station, and the rest of the other team would stay out on the platform. A couple of times we got caught.
A couple of stories about we didn't like each other. We used to take the train back from Montreal to Detroit here, or Toronto to here, and we'd have traveled by train that first 10 years that I was in the league. And we used to have to walk through their Pullman car to go to the diner, and nobody would say a word. The odd thing would be, we'll see how tough you are tonight. We're going back to Detroit. Things like that. There was not much conversation, believe me.
Long before the original Six era debuted in 1942, hockey was being played in small arenas built for boxing, wrestling, basketball, even the circus. In the early 1900s, the then unknown treasures of Olympia Stadium, the Montreal Forum, Chicago Stadium, Madison Square Garden, Maple Leaf Gardens, and the Boston Garden were erected. They would later serve the hockey gods as graceful cathedrals, houses of worship for the sport's loyal fan base. Each of the original 6 teams has moved into more modern quarters in the past 25 years. But it's hard to argue with history, and with those who say the charm and aura of hockey's inspired cathedrals will never be duplicated.
The architecture and aura of the old arenas was really special. Again, it was like watching a game from your living room at times. I remember the one thing that really struck me about the Boston Garden was that all 5 senses were engaged in a game. The noise of the building could just be dynamic. A crowd really roaring in the Boston Garden literally shook the foundations. You could feel it in your toes. Also, if you sat in a first balcony seat, which was almost over the ice, not unlike the right field pavilion at Tiger Stadium, you could sometimes smell the aftershave on the linesman or the referee at a hockey game. Amazing.
I personally was always impressed, of course, by the Forum. Although, not because of its architecture, I think, but just the fact that it was the Forum. And I always thought Maple Leaf Garden was way overrated. I loved Olympia in Detroit. I thought Boston Garden was just an occupied coal bin most of the time. And I liked Madison Square Garden, once again, because of the history.
Madison Square Garden, the original Madison Square Garden, the Boston Garden, the Olympia in Detroit, probably those 3 particularly, so intimate, where there were pillars and posts around the arena, but that enabled the balconies to come out over the ice.
So the ice surfaces were different. Montreal had a large ice surface, and you had to adjust your play up there too, because the ice was very fast. It's so cold up there, and the ice was fast always. we'd go to Toronto, and for some reason or other, the ice would chip so easily in Toronto. Chicago, you'd almost fall flat in your face because it was always sticky for some reason or other, and the puck would not maneuver around the way you wanted it. And so it took you a little while to get used to that. New York Rangers, although Boston Garden ice surface was small, the New York Rangers had the smallest ice surface, hardly no center ice whatsoever. So you had to be careful there all the time because the defensemen were always waiting for you, and you had to be looking over your shoulder around everybody, you might say. Obviously, they didn't have too far to throw the peanuts and things at you too if they wanted to.
So the intimacy with which you experienced these games was unlike anything that exists today, because the buildings were not built for multi-use. They were built for multi-use in terms of sports, but as concert arenas and concert venues, that market didn't really exist back then, so that they were primarily places for, sweaty guys to battle it out on skates or to throw baskets. And this was true with really all of the original 6 arenas.
When you'd go to some buildings, especially Chicago, it was so noisy with that organ they had in there. And the fans, they just never kept quiet. It was, you'd almost have a headache by the time you got out of that building because it was so loud. But we played on it. One thing I enjoyed, I liked it when the people got vocal and picked on me. To me, they were concerned about you, they were worried about you. And that kind of built me up. I used to say, hey, they're talking about me, they're thinking about me, I must be doing something right.
Story in the old arenas, when you stop to think why they were built back in the late 20s, in fact, Detroit's Olympia of 1927, they were built for boxing and wrestling, believe it or not. New York's Madison Square Garden, Boston, Chicago, where you could look down from above and see the ring.
The atmosphere, without all of the heavy metal music, without all of the promotions going on between face-offs and between periods and so on, it was all focused on the game. It's what it was all about, and there were no diversions. So what did people do between periods? They talked about the game. It was amazing.
Montreal was one of the places I don't think I was liked at all. As in those days, a lot of people wore those half rubbers, for snow and so on. And I think I've had a few of those thrown at me, but none ever hit, But I prided myself. I knew that if they were on my case that I was working and I was doing my job.
I can remember always a traffic jam on Grand River. What a wonderful traffic jam. Just wonderful because it was Sunday night. Game was at 7:30, 8 o'clock probably. And I could feel the excitement in the street because people were running between the cars, you see. They're parking out in all these little parking lots over here, and they would run between the cars to try to get there fast. And you could just feel the excitement.
And when you're 18 years old coming out of Western Canada, where they held 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 at the most, and then come into a building like Chicago and they seat 18 to 20,000. And they had an organist there, Al Melgart, that was just, he would get the crowd. It seemed like they were standing up all the time, or halfway up.
Well, I'd say outside of playing at home at the Forum, I like to play in Boston and Chicago. New York was a little difficult because it was a shorter rink, so the center ice wasn't as big as it is today. It was about 15 feet shorter, and that's a lot of room.
He was funny on the organ, too. I could tell you the story. If the referee made a bad call, he'd play Three Blind Mice on the organ, and the crowd would just go crazy. It was probably the noisiest stadium in the league. And New York wasn't far behind, because New York was like Olympia. They had the balconies, and you felt like the people were just, right up over top of you.
The stadium was selling out in the 60s to see the late 50s and the 60s to see Bobby Hull and Nikita and Glenn Hall and the Blackhawks and Coach Billy Ray and stuff. And so they became a formal dress code in the box seats. Gentlemen had to wear coats and ties. and the ladies couldn't wear pants. So that was enforced because everybody was waiting in line to get tickets. There was, season tickets were sold out.
Let's start with the fans back then. I think they were more involved in the game. They understood the game in all the rinks. Maybe Chicago a little more boisterous than the rest of the league. Maybe it was the acoustics in the building, I don't know. But the rinks, to me, were conducive to hockey. Everything was like this, compact. You're not sitting up there where you need oxygen. And the guys, the noise might have turned into a din, but it, like I say, I really enjoyed playing in the old rink.
Just like the cathedrals of hockey, the men who pioneered the sport left a legacy of distinctive personalities. They had great nicknames like Chief, Gentleman John, and Terrible Ted. They were approachable off the ice and feared on it. It is the character of the men that truly defined the original Six era.
I'll never forget after he retired, we used to have old-timers games at our stadium, the Olympia Stadium in Detroit. And so they'd bring back some of the old guys. And we had a game one year between the Montreal Old-Timers and the Detroit Old-Timers. Ted Lindsay was ejected from the Old-Timers game for getting into it with Dickie Moore of the Montreal Canadiens. They were bitter rivals. And can you imagine getting kicked out of an exhibition Old-Timers game? That's what happened.
Let's see. I never get beat. No, never. When when he saw me, when I went to the NHL, because the Detroit Red Wings came to Quebec City for an exhibition. And my coach, Ponchim Lac, told me, if you fight Ted Lindsay, he said, don't worry about that. He never dropped his stick. So I had a fight with him, but he was knocked out. But he had his stick on his hand. He never dropped his stick.
And they had a great line here in Detroit with the production line with Gordy and Ted Lindsay and Sid Abel. And one complimented the other. Sid was a great passer, and they were both great goal scorers. And Gordy took care of the other two if they got in a fight or a skirmish or anything like that. He would come in and settle things down.
When Ted Lindsay played here, he brought incredible competitive zeal to this team. I mean, he hated anybody wearing the other uniform, whether it was his best friend or not.
If there's any one hockey player that never deserved the credit he should have had, it was Sid Abel, who played in between Howe and Lindsay. It was always Howe and Lindsay. Very little was said about Sid. And Sid, in my estimation, was a tremendous center ice man, too.
The competitive nature and spunk that helped define the era wasn't limited to those who wore the skates and carried the lumber. It could also be found in coaches and management, where owners did their very best to provide an edge and coaches tried to milk the most from their charges.
The Montreal Canadiens simply dominated the league. They had a general manager, Frank Selke, who wouldn't help any other team. He just wanted to make sure that the Montreal Canadiens would be first, would have the best record, would win the Stanley Cup. And year after year, he just made arrangements. Things just kind of leaned toward the Montreal Canadiens. For instance, at one stretch, they had a rule passed in the National Hockey League that a team could not draft a French player from Quebec. That player would go to Montreal automatically because he was French.
Jack Adams was a dandy. All the stories I ever heard that, he was a tyrant and he scared the players. He used to walk around with railroad tickets sticking out of this pocket so they could see. He didn't put them in here. Back to Indianapolis, see? And the guys would sit there after the games like this, particularly the games they lost, they go like this. And if they saw those two black shoes in front of them, they didn't even want to look up. Jack Adams. and it was coming, see? It was coming, and he would go into the dressing room between games, and Lefty Wilson, the trainer, would have cut up oranges so the players could suck on them between periods. I don't know what good that did, but that's what they did. He'd go in there and get the basket and take these oranges and start flinging them at the players, one after the other, going like this. Instead of getting instruction about what to do and how to handle these guys, they're ducking oranges, see? So he was really a very, very tough guy, but he had a heart of gold, too.
I've always kind of remember in 1955 when Toblik became, and a former Canadian player, but became coach. I always remember his first speech. He looked around the room and he said, I have a great hockey player here. But if we want to win anything, we got to help each other. We got to play together. And he was so right. You know, when you have great athletes on the same team, we want to be on the ice. You want to be on the playing field. But he had the ability to keep everybody happy. And I think he was a big factor in the fact that, from 56 to 60, we had 5 cups in a row. And
you'd even have owners that would be competitive with each other. Conn Smythe of the Maple Leafs hated the Bruins. He, for some reason, just could not stand Art Ross. And whenever there was a chance for the Maple Leafs to show up the Bruins, he'd come to Boston on the train. He was a very stylish dresser. He wore spats and a 3-piece suit. And at some point during a game, because I've seen a cartoon of this, he actually got up and walked along the top of the boards, yelling at the referees and Bruins players. And at one point, Art Ross yelled to one of his players to get a stick and knock him off.
Perhaps the most revered line in hockey history wore the Boston Bruins uniform. Affectionately called the Kraut line, Milt Schmidt, Bobby Bauer, and Woody Dumart grew up together. When they turned pro, they lived together. When they played together, it was on the same dominant line. And then World War II came along. They joined the military together. Their legend is part of hockey lore.
They were like characters out of fiction. They grew up in the same town at Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. They arrive in Boston at roughly the same time, within about a year and a half of each other, and are put together on the same line. And throughout the years they played together for the Bruins, not one of them was paid a dime more than the others. And for most of that time, they lived in a rooming house in Brookline. They were like the 3 musketeers carrying a lunch pail.
We'd criticize one another. Particularly, I got a lot of criticism because either I'm passing too much to the left side or I'm not passing enough to the right side, but overall, we didn't do too badly.
You talk about Hollywood scripts. They enlisted in World War II at the same time. And the last game they played before going to war was against the Montreal Canadiens. At the conclusion of that game, the Kraut line were lifted on the shoulders of players from both teams and carried off the ice.
I can still hear the ovation that we received. It was tremendous. I, for one, can honestly say that I never ever heard a bad word said about myself or Schmidt, you're lousy or anything like that. But the ovation that we received the first night was tremendous, and which we are, 3 of us are very grateful to the fans here in Boston who treated us like champs, like we won the championship every year.
It's amazing that they were the first line to have all 3 members of the line be 1, 2, 3 in the league in scoring. You think of it, they're on the ice at the same time. There are only so many points that can be handed out in these games. They were scoring them all. They were brilliant.
Glenn Hall is one of the most successful goalies in hockey history, but he's remembered more by longtime Blackhawks employee John Robertson for his queasy stomach than his game-breaking saves.
The greatest goalie that I've seen was Glenn Hall. Poor guy would be so upset. He'd go up those 27 stairs to the ice for practice, and he'd have to turn around and come down and upchuck because in those days, the players played with intensity.
And then, of course, there is the Rocket, Maurice Richard, remembered by everyone as the greatest offensive player of his generation. Struck fear in his opponents for his uncanny ability to score goals and knock you over like a freight train on the same shift. The Rocket passed away a few years back, and an entire nation mourned.
The greatest hockey player from the Blue Line In, it's always been to me, is Rocket Richard. There'll never be a better one. I've said that 100 times, and I'll repeat myself again. And he was a tremendous athlete. He was focused. Every night he came to play, he came to win. Not just to play, he came to win. And from the Blue Line In, when he had the puck on his stick, there was only one focus in his mind, and that was to score a goal and to beat you, the enemy. And so he was just a tremendous athlete, strong physically, had a hate, which I had a hate. We hated each other, basically. It was a wonderful way to play hockey.
But he was somebody that you had to watch, too, because I remember one night, this is a little bit crooked, and he was back-checking one night, and he got me a cat, and he cut me across here, and he broke it. I said, "Okay, Rocket." I says, "You're going to get yours." So I caught him one night in an open switch. When I said an open switch, I mean we both happened to curve right into one another, but I was peeking and I could see him, and he didn't think about it, and I jumped at him in the last second. He got up and he says, "Why you do that?" I said, for that reason.
While 25 years of hockey produced some great players and even better characters, the names that rolled off the tongues of interview subjects might surprise you. Many of the memorable characters of the day were lesser known, who may have impressed their opponents through hard work.
The owner, Jim Norris, used to compare Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita. And he said, well, Bobby Hull is the Babe Ruth type, big power, the slugger, strong guy. He said, and Stan is more like Ty Cobb, who was a finesse player, hit and run, beat the ball, beat out of the infield, grounder, slice a single over the second baseman's head, but beat you any way he could. And he said, that's how I compare the two, as Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb.
The guy I had the most trouble was Stan Mikita, because I don't say the other players were not good. They were all good, but the only thing is, most of the players, after a while, you know what they're going to do. They, like Bobby Hull was really good, but if he used to come on me, I know he was going to shift on one side. He wouldn't go both ways. Mikita and Todd Sloan, there was two. They used to come at you, and you didn't know which side they were going to go. So it's a lot tougher. Even when you know he's going to go on that side, all you have to do is you just wait, you follow him.
I like to think of the best center iceman that I played against was Sil Apps from Toronto. Perfect gentleman both on and off the ice. You never had to worry about any knees or butt ends or dirty checks from Sil. It was just ability against ability, and I enjoyed that.
When I first started following the Hawks, their goalie was Emo the Cat Francis, who was famous because Emo was the first goaltender to take a baseball first baseman's mitt and put a little cuff on it. And instead, before, if you look at older hockey pictures, goalies used two blockers. And it's pretty hard to fend off with your non-stick hand a shot. So Emo came up with the idea of using a first baseman's mitt to trap the shot.
But we had a big team in Chicago. When you name guys like Glenn Hall and Bobby Hull and Mikita and Skov and Eddie Litzenberger and Billy Hay. We had about Eric Nestorenko. We had about 12 guys that were 6 feet and over, weighing over 200 pounds. We had a great defense corps, which was Pierre Palat, Moose Vasco, Al Arbor, who was a big coach with the Islanders, Jack Evans, who was a big coach in the NHL, and myself. We were the 5 defense. When we played in Chicago, mostly, anybody come in our zone would walk out on 4s. That means they were crawling out, because we made sure that the guys would get hit.
I went into the Red Wing dressing room. Gordie Howe was there, And Gordy really didn't like to be interviewed. What he would do is he would get you and press you against the locker with his shoulder and hurt. And then you couldn't ask him questions. Or he would grab you and squeeze your arm. It would hurt, see? And he would grab you someplace else, which I wouldn't say here on the television. That would really hurt, just to get you away from him, see? So I went through this routine one night, and I said to him, I said, you make $35,000 a year. Every year they give you $35,000. Today, Brooks Robinson, third baseman for the Baltimore Orioles, signed for $100,000. Close, $100,000. And I said, why don't you go in and ask for $100,000? You crazy? Gordie Howe would never do that. So that following summer, we're at a charity golf tournament. I didn't play, but I always liked to watch because the guys were playing. And Gordie Howe came up to me and he said, I want to shake your hand. For what? He says, well, remember that talk we had that night about my salary? He says, yes. See, what they would do is that Norris would come in from Chicago with the people in Detroit who ran the Red Wings, and they would call in Gordy and give him the same $35,000 every year. So Bruce Norris comes in, and the other executives are there. And, hey, Gordy, how you doing? How's the summer going? Blah, blah, blah. How's it? Fine. Well, he says, what do you think? He says, I think I want $100,000. He's telling me this story. I said, what did he say? He says, okay, anything you want, Gordy.
And Doug Harvey, when he played with the Canadians, and I watched him here, was the ultimate quarterback. He controlled the whole pace of the game. If he wanted to make it fast, the passes were crisp and fast. He wanted to slow it down. He took his time, stick handling, moving the puck out very slowly.
John Busick is probably one of the better hitting forwards that I have ever seen. And he used to catch a lot of guys coming around their net, but he had a rear end on him that was used to stick out quite a bit. And besides that, he's a good goal scorer, John was.
Well, some days it was fun and some days it wasn't. But I think the big point about the Canadians with the rivalry we had, and when it came to the playoffs, it was fun because we were all taught that when you come to the playoffs, you play the way you were taught.
Elmer was a very good hockey player to play against because you didn't have to worry too much about any dirty deals or anything like that. Except once in a while, at the beginning, you'd face off and he'd have his famous saying. He says, hi, Dad, how are you? I says, hello, Elmer, how are you? The puck would be dropped, bingo, I'd get an elbow. I says, oh, Elmer. I says, is that the way it's going to be? And so we'd laugh with one another. Maybe it might have been an accident or something like that.
He was a full-time trainer and part-time goalie for the Detroit Red Wings. Backup goalies were a luxury teams couldn't afford, so the trainers usually doubled as practice goalies and emergency replacements. Lefty was unique. Not only was he summoned to play in an NHL game, he twice wore the uniform of the opponent, tending goal against the players he often stitched up.
I went to training camp with the club in 1945, and I thought I couldn't stop a balloon in practice, but when we played the games, I didn't do badly. I had 1 goal and 3. You only played a half a game those days. Another goaltender come in. This is in training camp, and I thought I had a pretty good one. So we're in Michigan University. We're playing a game, and Jack says, hey, kid, here, come here. What I'm going to do with you, I'm going to send you to Omaha, Nebraska, as spare goaltender and trainer. Didn't know too much about either job. But we got by. Tommy Ivan was the coach, and Jimmy Skinner was the defenseman, and Howe was a forward. And we had a pretty good club, and we won it.
Rivals make the game. Just like the unique personalities of the men who pioneered the sport, the rivalries between teams and players fueled the league. When you play an opponent 14 times a season, a certain hatred will develop. It's unavoidable. And perhaps more than anything, the great rivalries that blossomed over the 25 years of the original Six era left an undeniable watermark on the sport's history.
Sid Abel, who was a player, coach, and general manager with the Red Wings, he once said that, and it's a great quote, it's one of the best quotes I've ever had in my life as a newspaper man. He said, "We play hockey for money, but we'd play those Toronto Maple Leafs for nothing." You see, and a Saturday night in Maple Leaf Gardens was like going to Mecca to see the ultimate hockey, see? And you'd go up there and you'd stay at the hotel and you go to the Maple Leaf Gardens and you could feel the passion even before the game started.
But it was a fair rivalry. If I got hit one night in Detroit and they played against us the next game, I'd get the guy that hit me. And it was like that all the time. It was a battle, and each game was a sort of a battle. Fair enough. And we used to hit a lot in those days. Of course, today the players are 6'5" and 6'6" and 6'7".
There was really 3 teams in the league at the time, Montreal, Detroit, and Toronto, where it was actually a vendetta. Well, it was war, but a clean war. Guys played hockey, and if they could hit you, they would hit you. But it wasn't with intent to injure or put you out permanently. It was their way of protecting their livelihood. So between the 3 teams, it used to get downright nasty.
I've got Chicago and Boston playing next night back in Chicago. In the meantime, I checked in this hotel and went upstairs and put my bag in the room. And I put the TV on to make sure it works, and I got a hockey game on. Well, the hockey game was a big fight on. And they were fighting the same 2 teams, that I got next night back in Chicago. And they busted down the Zamboni door. Everybody on the ice was fighting, And I remember I says, "I'm not going nowhere tonight." I just phoned down room service, give me up about 3 or 4 beers, and I'm going to sit and watch the end of this game,
There was a lot of rivalry between every team. You're playing back-to-back hockey games, which if you got one of their players or 2 of their players, they'd get you back when you went back in their rink. It was like playoff hockey all year, all season.
Chicago, New York, and Boston, one of the teams had to make the playoffs, but that was no concern of the 3 teams that were involved in this vendetta. I mean, it was outright war.
We had pretty well set lines. I know when I played Chicago, I was playing the Mikita line. When I was playing Detroit, I play against Delvecchio a lot, New York Rangers. So we had Boston. We had kind of a set play, or the coach. We tried to match line for line.
I enjoyed, like Maurice Richard. I think it took 10 years after we quit playing that he would even talk to me. And it's a funny thing. I ran into him on a bus in Florida one time, and he was with another couple that I knew also out of Montreal. And my wife and I got on the bus to go into Miami, and who's sitting there but the Rocket and his wife and this other couple. And as soon as he saw me, he went to the back of the bus. So this is the way he was, though. Anybody he played against, he just didn't care for,
The Maple Leafs and Bruins were real rivals back then. The rivalry with the Canadiens hadn't really developed to full flower yet. And the Maple Leafs were really the nemesis team of the Bruins for the 30s and 40s. The Rangers would come after that, and the Canadiens gradually came in after that. But for example, matchups would be Syl Apps, the great Maple Leafs player, versus Milt Schmidt. There'd be arguments about, who's the better player? Would you trade Apps for Schmidt? And it was great because, again, it was a serial drama, a soap opera that carried through the whole season because these guys would be playing against each other sometimes twice a week.
The rivalry between Detroit and Montreal, Detroit and Toronto, grew and grew and grew. Couldn't get a ticket at Olympia. Couldn't get one in Montreal Forum or Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens. And many of the boys loved Montreal and Toronto, but they wore Red Wing jerseys. They were Red Wing players now.
Sometimes it was atrocious, if I may use the word. However, we had a lot of chance. You didn't see too many times you would not retaliate at the time if somebody gave you the business. Why, you still had maybe another 6, 7, 8 games to play against them. And so you'd have to wait until maybe the next game when you wasn't expecting something, and that's when you would try to, fair as you could do to get a hold of them.
I think the league was tougher, and players carried grudges. They have great memories, and Gordie Howe was an example of one who, he said, never forgot.
We're on the road with the team, and there's a game in Montreal, and I'm an Irish boy, and it was on St. Paddy's Day, 1955, at the Montreal Forum, and Rocket Richard had been suspended the day before by Clarence Campbell, president of the National Hockey League, for altercations with the linesman.
They were had 4-2 after one period when riots broke out, with smoke bombs and everything aimed at Clarence Campbell. And they had to go out the back door so they would get in on a riot.
We get to the dressing room, next thing you know, Sulky, the manager of the Canadiens, had slipped a note on the door, game forfeited, police escort to Westmount Station. Rocket Richard had to go in French and English, pleading at the fans not to take things in their hand. 13,000 people in the Montreal Forum, and the number of people on the street, young kids from all the suburbs, I guess, and they outnumbered the police by about 200 to 1.
Then they came to Detroit that Sunday, and I went down to the Michigan Depot railroad station to travel by train. And I waited for the Canadians to arrive, and there were cops all over the place. And they formed a little wall for the Canadians, and the fans wanted to kill them. They were screaming and yelling and everything. And I said, my God, look, feel the passion of the people. We went to the game that night, and I would say that there was a sea of blue everywhere. They had policemen in every section, in every row, in every aisle. It was a weird look. Couldn't believe it. And of course, the Red Wings ruined the evening. They won 6-0. They had 6 goals in a half a game. And I'll never forget Ted Lindsay doing the war dance in front of the Canadian goalie after they had scored a goal.
Well, of course, the rivalry, Boston and Montreal, that get in the playoffs. Montreal would eventually win, but you would have Milt Schmidt in his declining years, still a great, talented player. And he'd be up against the first line of the Montreal Canadiens. Elmer Lack would be at center, Rocket Richard on the wing to check him. A great matchup in 1952. The Bruins barely made the playoffs, just finished 4th. And they were up against Detroit Red Wings, who had simply marched right through the league. There was no question that Detroit was going to win the Stanley Cup playoffs. They went to Detroit, and Detroit won the first game, and they're just planning on their next series. And then game 2, the Bruins upset them, and eventually upset them in the series, thanks to great defensive work by Woody Dumart, who with Milt Schmidt was a member of the crowd line of the Boston Bruins. And Dumart was assigned to cover Gordie Howe, and he just about bottled him up for the whole series, and that won it for the Bruins. So great strategy in this 6-team league.
Great things happened at Maple Leaf Gardens. One night, they had a death threat to Lindsay and to Howe. But they want to shoot him during the game. So what does Lindsay do? He comes out before the game and holds a stick up like a machine gun and goes, tat, tat, tat. Now, wait a minute. That just doesn't happen anymore. They had such passion for trying to beat each other. It was incredible. Anytime Canadiens or Maple Leafs came into Olympia, you knew you always went a half hour earlier not to get caught in the traffic, And it was just marvelous because the intensity was real.
I am sitting 10 feet away in the bench, waiting for my turn to go on the ice. And Teeter's line was out, and they were coming down to the Detroit end. Now, Teeter's carrying the puck. And if you know hockey at all, if you're carrying the puck, you're not looking to hit anybody. You're trying to get down the other end and make a play or score or anything. Anyway, Gordie and Teeter didn't see eye to eye. Why, I don't know. Teeter's never fought. You know, he might protect himself, but he's never initiated any fights. And Gordy's coming up this way, and Teeter's coming this way, right in front of our bench. Gordy decides, well, I'm going to get a piece of this guy. He comes across, and Teeter was a hard, what they call a hard skater. He wasn't the smoothest, but he got results. Anyways, Gordy, and maybe from 10 feet away, Teeter sort of hesitated a second, and I guess Gordy might have lost his footing, but it was too late to do anything to protect himself. He was that close to the boards. He hit his head, and that could have caused a riot that night in Detroit because they thought Kennedy did something to Gordy, which was not the fact at all. I mean, I'm watching it right there. And I bear witness to this day that Hal brought this all on to himself. He just sort of lost it. You know, like I say, too close to the boards to do anything about it to protect himself. Banged into it, and he was seriously injured. I mean, they say death might have been on the doorstep, but anyway, from then on, every game with Detroit was, you got looking over your shoulder.
When I was working for the Red Wings, big snowstorm hit during the game. Went out afterwards. I could not get my car out of the snow. Out comes Gordie Howe. He's just played 60 minutes of hockey. Came up, lifted up the front end of my car and got me out. I mean, it was nothing. I mean, here's the big star of the National Hockey League. Oh, you got a problem? Let me help you out. And he had the power to do it. I couldn't do it.
You get 10 thrills a year. Every time you get your paycheck, that's a thrill.
When I played, many guys used to get stitches. They always wanted more because the insurance would give them $10 a stitch. So instead of having 3, the guys say, put some more, put some more, put some more.
He said, the motor is great. He said, all you need is a tune-up. So he went in there and tuned me up. So?
I can't think of his first name now. Peter Cusimano. Thank you, in the left field bleachers.
Hitting Louis something terrible, you know. The uppercuts in his right, and then he with his right hand, he dislocated his finger, middle finger on his right hand. Get out of here, fly.
It's a kid's dream. You know, once you get to the NHL, that's what you dreamt about since you're 6 years old. Unfortunately, I broke my leg at 7, so it broke my dream pretty fast. But I did come back.
And that's a true story. It won't change. I didn't make it up because you're going to run it on the air and get me in trouble. But it's true. It really is true. Question. We can meet later on. I'll send my wife home. He can take my wife out. You and I can.
And also the bad feature of it was if you played the first game, there's 2 games all the time. Well, it wasn't bad because we didn't have the equipment, and we left the equipment in the rink all the time. But if you're in the second game, you'd have to wait until they finished, then you'd use the equipment that players used in the first game. It was all sweaty. But it was a day off the station, so it wasn't all that bad.
It's better than being kicked with a frozen boot in the middle of winter, they say.
Chicago had mesh. There was no glass around. It was mesh, and if the guy ran you into boards, your face would go into the mesh once in a while, you know. And of course, we never, I got 300 stitches in the face. Yeah. But I healed well. 3 broken noses, broken cheekbone, broken jaw, broken fingers, broken leg. But I had fun. I enjoyed the game. I waited until I got better, and I dressed up again and restarted to play.
I also stayed in shape by training Harry Hurst, who was a fighter, and he was a Canadian champion. But I'd go into the ring with him, and because he didn't have anybody else to spar with. But I said, hit me any place, but don't hit me here.
You talked about camaraderie.
Not very well. Maybe you ought to try the other question.
If you know what, I can also maybe give a little bit of history as to why a lot of people were fascinated by the Blackhawks, despite the fact that they were not a very good team for a number of years. I remember some very colorful, they were probably the most colorful bunch of losers in hockey history. They were the Brooklyn Dodgers of hockey.
Now, that was a rehearsal, eh?